Welcome to Litpoetry, the podcast where we go on a journey of discovery, reading, analyzing, and discussing great poetry from around the world. Poetry is worth it because the reading and writing of poetry is a revolutionary act that has the potential to transform both the reader and our world.
Welcome to the Litpoetry Podcast Season 1. My name is James Laidler, Australian poet, writer and your host. In today's episode we'll be stepping into the world of beeping life support machines, sterile operating theatres, failing organs, open wounds and second chances with the absolutely stunning poem Lady Lazarus by Australian poet Carly J. Metcalfe. Partially inspired by a poem of the same name by Sylvia Plath, Carly J takes us on a harrowing journey that is certainly not for the faint of heart. The poem, like a razor-sharp scalpel, cuts deep into the soft, fleshy skin of our fragile human condition. The poet herself, who was born with cystic fibrosis, uses the poem as a vehicle to document the completely traumatizing experience of undergoing a full lung transplant. Yet despite the arduous journey the poem takes the reader on, what emerges is not defeat, but a hymn of stubborn resistance, hope and beauty. This is a remarkable achievement for a poem. And thankfully we have Carly J with us today on the podcast to discuss both the poem and her work. But before I introduce you to Carly, let's take a listen to the poem, shall we? May I present to you Lady Lazarus, read to you by the wonderful Lucy Freeman.
I have done it again. 1 year in every 10 I manage it. A sort of walking miracle of bacteria, antibiotic, and flesh. This biomedical poultice in a petri dish, spinning brindle like the wolf at my feet as we walk by the river's brim. It would get down to this, plain and simple. A regiment of women in white rhyming lines, tapping burettes and wiping licks of blood off broken skin as I'd yell, thick-throated and venal, that they cannot do what they are about to do, but they do, and I would smell it, like a cow smells the blade of a knife in a kill yard. Dying is an art like everything else. I do it exceptionally poorly. Yeast in my blood, dead lungs, a bloodied mass in my lap, a head full of small brutalities. The bones worry when you dig your own grave with one finger, they do. They do, it's true. They worry when you dredge up a salute to your old life under the guise of ending another. Fracturing a fall forward, your hunger becomes an exercise in mercurial discord. But when you've mended your chest with a bagging needle, learned to pray over a burning ark, made your weekly pilgrimage to the cemetery, the silence is tempered, and you must sit in your mercy seat and sing, sing, sing euphorically.
So welcome back to the Lit Poetry Podcast and welcome to you, Carly J. I'm so pleased to finally be talking to you on the podcast.
Oh, James, thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be here from a distance.
Well, like I said, it's a pleasure having you on the podcast, and it was a real pleasure receiving your poetry. Initially, I was in communication with you and you sent me a number of poems, and you isolated this one in particular. I was really quite moved by it. and I thought it would really work well with the sort of form of work that I do here at Litpoetry.
Yeah.
And for those listeners out there, if you get a chance to watch the video on YouTube, I think it's quite a powerful poem, and visually it meshes together really well. And I suppose why we're here is to talk about your story, Carly. And yeah, so why don't we start by, I'll ask you a little bit about your work as a poet and your inspirations and how your love of poetry developed, and perhaps how that's also connected to the health troubles that you had growing up.
Yeah, I guess, well, it's all connected, I suppose. I guess poetry for me, it all really started with Sylvia Plath in high school, which isn't an uncommon phenomenon for an angsty teenage girl. I found an old book of hers in this incredible bookshop that sold second-hand and really old books in Brisbane, first edition, that sort of thing. And the first poem I read of hers was Daddy, and that was like a shot through the heart. I remember having this really visceral reaction to it and having to actually sit down. So on that particular day, I tore through Ariel, and then I remember reading Death and Co. over and over again in maths class when I shouldn't have been. And the line that I kept saying was, "Bastard, masturbating a glitter. He wants to be loved." I was just in awe, and then I think I fell into a bit of a depression because I then found out that she had taken her own life and there weren't going to be any more Sylvia Plath poems. So that's when I started collecting all of her journals and short stories and her letters home. I read letters home, I think it was in grade 11, so I would have been about 16. And it was when I was actually in hospital. I had septicemia, but I was overjoyed that my parents had come up and given me this book. And I thought, I can die happy now. I've got this in my hands. And I slept with it for the entire hospital stay. I think that being a teenage girl, I suppose, she was really bombastic and even abrasive in her language. And she was just incandescently radical for her time and still is. I think she always will be. I think her work will stand the test of time. And then I guess a byproduct of reading Plath was reading Ted Hughes, and we had a bit of a prickly relationship with what he had done to my beloved Sylvia. But there's no denying his ability, I found and still find, to write about nature the way he did. It was incomparable. It was like nothing I'd ever read before, and it's hard to describe. And I think evocative, it doesn't really begin to cover it, but he makes it really easy to feel like you're there on the fox hunt or the rabbit hunt. And for me, that's what good writing does. It takes you from where you are and plants you in another realm. And I suppose these were days well and truly before the internet. So in high school, I'd trot off to the Lifeline Book Fest with a suitcase and scour the poetry section for anything I could find that I liked. And I found that I really loved the old guard, Keats, Wordsworth, Emily Dickinson, Edgar Allan Poe, Auden, Philip Luck, and I think there's a bit of a theme here. I seem to have this affinity for poets from the United Kingdom because they write so richly about nature and the old ways, and I'm a bit of a druid at heart.
Yeah, so you were really attracted to the romantic tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I guess from then, I eventually discovered Anne Sexton and Adrienne Rich and eventually Sharon Oz. And
they're amazing.
These three were like a panacea for everything I was going through: illness, becoming a woman, heartbreak, death, and I think like a lot of the people. Yeah, sorry.
Well, I'm just thinking because we'll have hopefully quite a few female listeners to the podcast, and And a lot of young women, as they're moving through life, certainly in my teaching, I found that if they discover the richness that is female poetry on their journey, it can be a real explosion. That seems to be what you're talking about. This rawness, this traction, that this voice that is so suppressed usually in society. And
it's almost shocking. I guess, like the confessional nature of, Sexton, Rich and Old and Plath. I found it to be, it was both comforting and shocking, and I love that duality. And there are firebrands of women, and they reminded me of my paternal grandmother, which I loved.
Wow. Yep. Yeah. It kind of wakes you up, doesn't it? From your apathy and the rest of it. I've seen a number of young women really transformed by some of the writers that you mentioned, quite radically, actually. Where we left off, talking about some of the female poets that you mentioned, and how they have, how they have a really amazing capacity to impact young minds in particular, and onward. So, how does that correlate? So, you mentioned a little bit about how that has impacted your own life, but it's in particular impacted this poem as well. And maybe that's where we should perhaps turn our attention a little bit. Carly J, could you give us a little bit of context about where this poem came out of and how it's linked to your health struggles and your story and that type of thing? Yeah,
sure. I've always had an affinity, I guess, with this poem and how Sylvia Plath wrote of her near-death experience. Because I've had quite a few myself. I guess the image of her, the imagery of her dying and then being brought forcibly back to life really speaks to me, because that's, I guess that's how my transplant felt, because I was actually dying when I had my transplant. I had less than a week to live without it, and I was totally at peace with that, that I was going to die. And then I was sort of violently shaken back into life. Like, I was not expecting to live. That was the last thing I was expecting. And there I was, and it was the violence of it that I think really traumatized me, among the 1,000 other things. But I suppose near-death experiences, mine might be a little more medically focused, whereas Plath's ended up being medicalised because of how unwell she was and her multiple suicide attempts. But
so both poems, they really do go in different directions, but there's that same sense that they share in common about that rising to life from impossible places. And in Plath's case, there's almost like the feeling that she kind of wished that she hadn't been brought back in some ways, that she longed for passing away and that sort of thing. I absolutely, I really connect with that, which sounds really strange.
But I was at such a place where, I was pretty out of it on morphine and what have you, and my doctor had actually said to me that day, "I'm so sorry we haven't been able to save you. I'm sorry we haven't been able to get you lungs." And I was in such a blissed out state. I said, that's okay. You've done the best you could, which is true. And they had done the best they could, but it just obviously wasn't meant to be. But then it was, and it was quite strange seeing him just hours later in a waiting room. And he said, this is way out. I said, "Oh, you're telling me." So I really wasn't expecting to survive for very long after that. And I suppose having a lung transplant, not being able to breathe, and then having all this breath afterwards, I suppose I did feel like a bit of a phoenix rising out of the ashes. I guess the difference was that Sylvia Plath demonically ate her doctors. That was something that would have appealed to me when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to hug and kiss my doctors after my transplant.
Yeah, so her poem's very much a feminist piece, which is looking at, female oppression and but yours also looks at, I mean, when I'm reading, for instance, the second stanza, there's where you talk about, I'm a sort of walking miracle of bacteria, antibiotic, and flesh, and then there's biomedical poultice in a petri dish, and this sort of stuff. That there seems to be this real detachment, this objectification of you as some sort of object in the medical machine, almost a reduction of something going on, a detachment, and to me, there's a real clear connection there with Lady Lazarus, Plath's version, a similar thing. So in the eyes of men, there's this objectification, this reduction, but it's a different experience for you. Is that what you were sort of going for?
Yeah, I was, and growing up, most of my doctors were men, and I think I became scared of men in white coats coming at me because they were either going to hurt me or they're going to yell at me. So it was almost this pathological fear, I suppose. So that was something that was quite heightened during my childhood.
Yeah, so there was a real regiment of these sort of experiences, I imagine, all through your young days growing up. And did you have a lot of bad episodes with your health and close calls and that sort of thing?
I was in hospital a lot, maybe for half my childhood. So yeah, in hospital a lot. In hospital more than most kids who were spending time in there. And I was growing up with other CF friends, and pretty much, not to be hyperbolic, but all of them were dying around me as I was growing up. It sort of really never let up until I was in my 20s. And I think I've lost about 80 friends of CF. And I I had a totally abnormal childhood. I was helping nurse my dying friends when I was, 10 and 11 years old, like totally abnormal, but it was normal for me. And it was something that I wanted to do because I love people and I love my friends so dearly. But it was for anyone coming in with a looking glass, they would probably want to put me in a bubble and observe me. And that actually happened a couple of times with psychiatrists wanting to diagnosed me with certain things growing up, that weren't actually there.
What sort of effect does that have on? What effect did that have on you in terms of? So you're basically on the precipice, often looking at death, and not just through the possibility in your own life, but your friends. That's what you're describing, which is it's really hard, I think, for most people to really understand the enormity of that and the significance. But I suppose the question is, how does that prolonged exposure to those experiences, how does that not crush you as an individual?
You know what? I was a really happy kid. I was the singer, actress, entertainer. I was 6 years old and I'd be jumping up on the kitchen table in the ward, singing "Life is a Cabaret." I was a really happy kid. And even though all of these awful things happened to me, for some reason it didn't totally crush my spirit. I think, and I really don't believe that bad experiences make you stronger. I think bad experiences can make you more mentally fucked up.
Yeah.
And I suppose that a lot of people would see suffering and trauma as grist for the mill, but I've never really seen it as such. It's just been, I think it's because it's been my constant. I've been born with this illness, and it's still with me 44 years later.
So, a couple of other things about the poem, Carly. One of the things I noticed about it, so Plath talks about dying being an art, and that she does exceptionally well. And you sort of flip that on the other side and talk about doing it exceptionally poorly. So
yeah, I'm really bad at dying, and I'm happy for it to stay like that. I suppose it's because I've had a few really close calls, particularly when I was 21 and waiting for a transplant, and then again when I was 31 when I had cancer. That nearly killed me as well.
And that was related to the treatment that you had in the lung transplant too. So.
Yeah. The anti-rejection drugs I take for transplant, which are for life, you take them for life, they're essentially cancer-causing, and it's really just the luck of the draw.
Yeah, are you happy to talk a little bit about this, or is it a bit too raw?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
nothing's off limits with me.
Okay, well that's great. So what was that experience like to go through the lung transplant and to get to the other side? And initially it didn't quite take, did it? You initially rejected the lungs. Is that true?
I did, yeah. In the first 2 weeks, I rejected my lungs, or my body rejected my donor lungs, and my doctors were calling hospitals all over the world trying to work out what to do. And in the end, they hit me with massive doses of steroids, not anabolic ones in my dreams, but corticosteroids.
Yeah.
And that saved my life.
Wow. Yeah. That's amazing. Because in the poem it talks about how you learned to pray over a burning ark. Was that it? So in my mind, and I could be completely wrong here, in the process of recovering, is that line attached to that? So some sort of inhaler that you had to breathe in when you were recovering, or?
I actually don't know. I haven't. It's funny. I haven't read Lady Lazarus, my version, for quite some time. I've seen your video version, which, can I just tell you that it was incredibly affecting. I'm not much of a crier. It takes a lot for me to cry, but I was writing in my local cafe and had tears streaming down my cheeks. So thank you, James. Well done.
Yeah. So you're out in public. Sorry about that.
Yes, no, it's perfectly all right.
Yeah. No. So the line says, I'll read it out to you. It says, fracturing a fall forward, your hunger becomes an exercise in mercurial discord. But when you've mended your chest with a bagging needle, learned to pray over a burning ark, made your weekly pilgrimage to the cemetery, and it goes on. But yeah, so I've got this sort of vision of you in this sort of recovery mode there. And it's interesting with poetry because it's always a work of interpretation. I could be completely off the mark here, but this is what I'm seeing. So I'm seeing some sort of medical intervention just to when you're on the other side, learning to cope with exactly what's happened to your body. But I found that line, learn to pray over a burning ark, really fascinating. And I was wondering, so the process, everything that you've gone through, has it turned you into a more like spiritual person? Is that a dimension of you that sort of resonates, or?
Absolutely. I had some unusual spiritual experiences as a child, which are really unexplainable scientifically, but they make total sense to me. I've always been spiritual, and I suppose I really cultivated that in my late 30s, and still am to a point. But I'm agnostic, but I have always, and this sounds so simplistic, I've always had faith that things will be okay. And that's what I had to believe. I had to believe that to get me through.
Yeah, well, I suppose
Yeah.
the other option is probably more what Plath perhaps faced, with a very deep
Yeah.
pessimism about the future. And spirituality, I suppose, presents something else to people.
Yeah.
And so, and this is connected to the work that you do. Am I right to say that you do some sort of hospice work and work with people who are actually travelling this road, recovery, and maybe facing the possibility of dying and that sort of stuff?
In 2015, I did my clinical pastoral care education, which is essentially I became a chaplain in Brisbane's biggest metropolitan hospital. So it was 3 months it was a 3-month intensive, and we were absolutely thrown in the deep end. So on the first day we were taken up to the wards and we were talking to patients, or the patients who wanted to speak to us. So, and I decided to do that for a few reasons. When I was growing up, and even as an adult, there haven't been any chaplains or pastoral carers who've been either atheist or agnostic, or just generally, secular, non-religious. And that's what I wanted to do, because I love people, and people are my passion. So I absolutely love the work that I do, or was doing pre-COVID. I don't think I'll be able to go back for a while. But, I mean, you would think the last place I would want to be would be in a hospital, but it was such a separate experience from being an inpatient to, freely walking around the wards and speaking to people.
Yeah, I imagine that connection would be very powerful for people too, them knowing that you had tread on a similar path to them. And that's also quite unusual too. What I'm hearing from you is to be a chaplain who is agnostic, and freely so, and entering into that space of uncertainty with people. There seems to be a lot of honesty in that position to me.
I actually don't share my story with patients, because these visits aren't about me. It's about me being a sounding board for them, in their worst moments. And sometimes that means me just listening and not saying a word. And I think that's my superpower. My superpower is listening. And I think in regards to being agnostic, I've often walked into a patient's room and I've said, "Hi, I'm from pastoral care," and I've been yelled at, "I don't want to talk about religion," and I just counter back with, "Well, neither do I," and they're like, "Oh," and that just it diffuses the tension, and they say, "Well, what are you doing here then?" And then I tell them that I'm actually not religious, and everyone has got a spiritual side to them, whether they like to admit it or not. Whether it's, I met a young guy in the spinal injuries unit who had crashed his truck, and his dog was, he was spiritual about his dog. It's the everyday, it's the little things. It's not these grand things, I think, that people believe spirituality to be about. It's the really simple things. Yeah,
so you're thinking the people have these sort of grounded realities or passions that run deep in them, and that actually connect them to things outside themselves. Is it an outside connection that you're talking?
Absolutely.
But yeah. And so you listen to people and allow that sort of spirituality to emerge and to nourish them.
I guess I listen to them. There's been a couple of really incredible. I've had a couple of really incredible encounters with patients, and one guy who had a kidney transplant and was waiting for another one. He was really sick, and we had a conversation for about an hour and a half one day, and he said, "I've been seeing a psychiatrist for 3 months, and you've just done more for me than he has in an hour and a half. So that was so lovely to hear that. I know it's not about me, and it might be a selfish thing to think, but I'd actually made a little bit of a difference.
Yeah, but the irony is you're saying it's actually through listening that might be the key, which I think is a really beautiful thought. And I'm wondering also if listening also extends into your practice of poetry, and how listening might be a tool when you go to write a poem or you're thinking about a poem. Is there a connection there with listening still for you and poetry?
Absolutely. I think I spent so much time on my own, as a patient, in waiting rooms, in hospitals for admissions and what have you. So I have always thought very reflectively, even as a young child. So I think that's something that's always been there for me, and I think sometimes I've got Mother Superior tattooed on my forehead because people just they've always wanted, even as a young kid, they've always wanted to tell me their story. And I think it's because I'm not only hearing them, I'm listening and I'm hearing them, because they're two totally separate things, and they're not used to being heard. And so they respond to that, and they tell me everything, and it's incredibly humbling. It's incredibly humbling. A public hospital, if you want to be humbled, you walk into any public hospital, and it is instant humility, an instant lesson in humility. Yeah.
I think you're right there. But I suppose that again, is that also the connection with poetry? I suppose that you can then refer. Yeah, and so if you're in say you're out in nature or something like that, it's actually by listening and asking, well, what does nature got to tell me here? Exactly.
Yeah, and I've spent a lot of time doing that as well. I love spending time in nature. That seems to be a panacea for anything I'm going through at a particular point. But I think getting back to the whole listening thing, I'm able to listen to not only other people, but I can listen to myself and know, it sounds a bit wanky, but know my authentic, true self. And a lot of people, I suppose, only skate on the surface of themselves because they don't want to go deeper.
Yeah, well,
and
that's fascinating.
And I totally understand that, because there's great pain in going deeper. But there's also a great release in it too.
Yeah, so I know just earlier you were very mindful to mention that you can't sort of boil down suffering to some sort of formula that it helps you grow and all this. It's kind of in some ways a bit cruel to be so to reduce things to those sort of equations. Yeah. But you are saying something connected to that here, but what your story and your journey has given you a greater sense of who you are. Is that what I'm hearing? And that you're more comfortable in who you are.
Yeah, I think so. I've always been very, very sure of who I am, and I don't know whether it's my personality. I was really out there as a kid, like I said, standing on a kitchen table, singing my little heart out, not giving a care in the world. But something interesting that happens after my transplant is that one of my vocal cords was paralysed during surgery, so I didn't have my voice anymore, and that was my currency, almost. So that was a huge, as much as I gained my life back, but I grieved for many years the loss of my voice because I was going to be a singer and an actress.
So your voice even now is different from what it was when you were?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah. My voice was this booming it was really quite incredible. I could impersonate singers like, Liza Minnelli and Aretha Franklin. It sounds pretty insane, but yeah, I was able to do that. So to go from doing that all my life to, I think that experience, the loss of my voice, made me quite a person.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thing.
Not less fierce, but quieter. Yeah.
Yeah, great. So, a couple of other questions I have for you, Carly. With your poetry, like what are you working on at the moment, and how do you find the Australian poetry scene in general? Like, how active are you in that space, and what are your plans for the future?
I'm not really active in the Australian poetry scene. I suppose the state of Australian poetry, I just sort of see it in drips and drabs, and okay, from where I've seen it recently, it's very highly charged, and there's good and bad that comes with that. I think the collective outrage that there hadn't been nearly enough diverse voices, especially from our First Nations people, I think that outrage is necessary and justified.
Yeah.
But I'm concerned about people who feel that cutting our ties with the old guard is going to solve all of our shocking history with our First Nations people. Like, what's been done cannot be undone, and there are incredible Indigenous poets out there like Ellen Van Neerven. I suppose, in a way, it saddens me that in an already divided country, people are so divided over what's acceptable and what is not, who is allowed to say and write certain things and who is not. And listen, I'm the last person who has any of the answers, but this isn't how we make progress. And it's not that the politics of poetry doesn't intrigue me, but my life is, I guess, walking on a razor's edge health-wise, so it's not something I invest a lot of my energy in. I mean, there is a dark underbelly of when it comes to Australian poetry, and no one likes to talk about the sinister side of things, the bullying, the tearing down, but there just seems to be this disconnect, I guess, a lack of compassion and basic human decency, which people are all about publicly, but it's the underhanded nature of poets going behind other poets' backs. When they don't have a full story about an issue, it can be quite toxic. And
well, that's right, and whispers spread very quickly now, and it can be.
That's right.
It can be brutal, and people can be cancelled.
That's right.
And there should be a level where that we can trust in conversation, that we can have conversation, that we can that everyone's got a voice. Everyone's got a voice.
That's right, and I suppose it just doesn't have to be like that. And my hope is that we can cultivate kindness instead of division. Like, there's a lot to be said for kindness and being in receipt of facts instead of almost being barraged with opinions. And you know, it gets back to that old-fashioned thing. You know, why can't people pick up the phone and speak to someone instead of going into a spiral of speculation? And it sounds cliched, but life really is too short just to sit behind a computer screen and see. I just struggle to understand it.
Yeah, and look, that's part of the aim of this podcast, is to get conversations happening, and hope. And you know, the hope is that sometimes we might be moving into some difficult areas, and that we're willing to go there.
Well, that's the hope. That's the hope.
Yeah, that's right. But I can also understand that, you know, there's a certain cultural happening in our society, and also rightfully there's a legacy of pain and suffering and injustice that needs to be addressed, and there is and there is rage in some people, so it's a really tricky area, I think. But like you said earlier, like with Sylvia Plath's partner and the way he treated her, and yet, his poetry, there is some beautiful poetry of his. And so how do you reconcile the fact that, we have this situation in our world, and I think there wouldn't be any writer or any human being that is perfect, that hasn't got flaws. But where do you draw the line, and where do you cancel people? It's really tricky, isn't it?
It is, especially right now, as Australia seems to be, I guess, taking on more of what the US is doing, which is unfortunate but inevitable, I suppose, washing across the oceans to us.
No, it is. Anyway, we'll see how that plays out. So look, I suppose probably come to a close, and I suppose I just want to ask you, ask all the guests that come on to the Litpoetry podcast, the final question, and that's basically, why poetry, Carly J?
Oh, that's a bit of a curly one. I mean, it's not as if I grew up reading poetry. My parents were working class folk who didn't have time to read when they were raising me and my sister. And some people might be really horrified by that. How could they even find time to read? But they really had big issues on their plate, like trying to keep me alive and giving my sister and I the best life that they could. I think when I found poetry, particularly Sylvia Plath in high school, it was a very visceral and unexpected thing. But when I started writing it was a way of channeling what was going on in my life. And when I think about my teenage years, which was a hotbed of suffering, dying and death, which sounds terrible, but that's how it was. I'm just calling it for how it was. Where a lot of my CF friends were dying. So reading and writing poetry was a way around and through the pain. I've never met a poem that hasn't been able to meet me where I am in the lay of my life, and that's what I love about poetry.
Well, that's a beautiful answer. Wonderful. So thank you so much for being on the podcast for this episode.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh no, it's been an absolute pleasure. Pleasure talking to you, Carly.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, James.
No worries. So it's time to wrap up this week's episode and say goodbye. But I'd like to leave you with a quick update. Next week is our final episode for Season 1. We've had an absolute blast, of course, bringing you these wonderful poetry-led discussions and interviews, so we won't be gone for too long. After a short break, we'll be back with Season 2, where we'll explore some more excellent poetry and talk to a host of new and interesting guests. If you've enjoyed the podcast, we'd really encourage you to hit that subscribe button. Your support is extremely important to us, and it encourages us greatly in our mission to deliver you great content. If you enjoyed the podcast today, don't forget to check out the video version of Carly's poem that is live now on our YouTube channel. We'll finish by listening one more time to the poem, this time set to a different piece of music to give it a completely different feel. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.
I have done it again. 1 year in every 10 I manage it. A sort of walking miracle of bacteria, antibiotic, and flesh. This biomedical poultice in a petri dish, spinning brindle like the wolf at my feet as we walk by the river's brim. It would get down to this, plain and simple. A regiment of women in white climbing lines, tapping burettes and wiping licks of blood off broken skin as I'd yell, thick-throated and venal, that they cannot do what they are about to do, but they do, and I would smell it, like a cow smells the blade of a knife in a kill yard. Dying is an art like everything else. I do it exceptionally poorly. Yeast in my blood, dead lungs, a bloodied mass in my lap, a head full of small brutalities. The bones worry when you dig your own grave with one finger, they do. They do, it's true. They worry when you dredge up a salute to your old life under the guise of ending another. Fracturing a fall forward, your hunger becomes an exercise in mercurial discord. But when you've mended your chest with a bagging needle, learned to pray over a burning ark, made your weekly pilgrimage to the cemetery, the silence is tempered, and you must sit in your mercy seat and sing, sing, sing euphorically.
You've been listening to the Lit Poetry Podcast, presented by James Laidler. For more podcasts, poetry videos, and other useful resources, visit our website at www.litpoetry.com. Thanks for listening.